Welcome once again to Heart of a Shepherd. We are concluding our study in the book of Song of Solomon today, our chapter reading chapter 7 and 8. Now, I've titled this devotional An Ever After Love Story. Consider then with me Song of Solomon 7. Now, as we continue studying the Song of Solomon, remember that I suggested earlier that there were three methods of interpretation for this book. One is the allegorical interpretation, proposes that the Song of Solomon describes God's relationship with his people and really acts as a parable. The second is the typical interpretation, which suggests that Solomon's bride was a symbol or picture of the church, and the groom, Solomon, represents Jesus Christ. Now, the third interpretation, and the one that I've preferred, is a literal one, which views the Song of Solomon as a genuine love story depicting Solomon's love for a young Shulamite peasant girl who became his queen. Let's consider our study today, beginning with a bridal description, chapter 7, and verses 1 through 9. And so, with her innocence and virtue entrusted to her husband, Solomon looked at his wife's physical beauty with both pride and satisfaction. He expressed his delight in his bride, and in verse 6 he boasted, and I quote, "How fair and how pleasant art thou, O love, for delights." In verse 7, in his eyes, she, this young bride, was majestic like a palm tree, and he tenderly assured her of his love in verses 8 and 9. Well, having heard her husband's proposition of his love and his care for her, in verses 10 through 13, the bride, confident in her husband's love, we read, with trusting love then, she committed herself to her husband in verse 10. She invited Solomon in verses 11 and 12 to take her away, saying, "Let us lodge in the villages, get up early to the vineyards, and there will I give thee my loves." Now, that brings us to Song of Solomon chapter 8. Now we see Solomon and his young bride heading back to her simple home in the villages of northern Israel. Now she invites her king, her husband, Solomon, to leave the grandeur of his palace in Jerusalem, and I quote, "go forth into the field and lodge in the villages," chapter 7 verse 11. Now the saying, "there is no place like home," really comes to mind when we read about her longing for the vineyards filled with tender grapes and buds of pomegranates. Now, not many people would suggest then an allegorical meaning for Song of Solomon 8, but I'm going to still stay with a literal interpretation of this beautiful love story. And so we have the bride's love and longing for her husband's company in verses 1 through 3. And so, like many newlywed couples starting their life together, it seemed our young bride did not find her new household as welcoming or comfortable as she had hoped. In her mother's house, she did not feel free to openly show her affection for her husband as she would in her private chamber. And so she thought that if Solomon had been her brother, she might have kissed him, and no one would have despised or condemned her. In other words, she was reluctant to show outward, visible affection in front of her family. And so there in her mother's house, she introduced Solomon the king, and we read in verse 2, she caused him to drink a spiced wine of the juice of her pomegranate. Now, in my opinion, the wine was unfermented juice, not the wine that would cause drunkenness, which, by the way, Solomon often condemned in his writings. Proverbs 20, Proverbs 23, Proverbs 31, all condemn drunkenness, intoxicating wine. Now, verses 4 through 5, we find the bride leaning on her beloved. Now, warning the young maidens, the daughters of Jerusalem, in verse 4, not to stir or arouse desires before marriage, this young bride appeared to go visit an elder, perhaps a grandmother or an aunt, who had taught and urged her to guard her purity when she was young. You notice that in verse 5. Of course, the reward for her virtue was becoming the prized bride of the king. Now, with a passion that seemed to expose her insecurity as the king's bride, she begged, and I quote, "Set me as a seal upon thy heart, as a seal upon thine arm, for love is strong as death." In verse 6, jealousy is cruel as the grave. The coals thereof are coals of fire, which have a most vehement flame. Well, knowing the king might one day take wives according to royal custom, although the Bible obviously ordains only that a man and woman would be one flesh, that is, one man for one woman, Genesis chapter 2 particularly. And yet this young bride longed for the reassurance that his love, Solomon's love for her, was sealed in his heart. So Solomon told her that even if flood waters could quench a fire, his love for her would never be extinguished, in verse 7. Now, verses 8 through 10, we find the bride's family welcoming her and her husband, the king. And so, returning to her village, the young bride's brothers greeted their sister and her husband, and they reminded her how they protected her when she was a girl and before her betrothal, in verse 8. So, using the analogy of a strong wall, they had shielded her virtue when she was young. And Solomon's bride, in verse 10, acknowledged her brother's memories, affirming that they had indeed kept her purity, or she had kept her purity, and gained favor in her beloved's eyes. Then verses 11 through 13, we have the bride's vineyard, her new lease on life. So verse 11 suggested that the vineyard where she first met Solomon was leased by him, the king, to her family. And she and her brothers worked as laborers and caretakers in a vineyard that belonged to someone else. Well, in verse 12, as the king's wife, she shared the vineyard with Solomon and seemed to negotiate what I would suggest was a new lease that was more favorable to her family. After all, they had become the in-laws of Solomon. Well, she happily returned to her husband and his luxurious gardens, in verse 13. Now, verse 14 records the bride's longing for her husband. And so this love story ends with our young bride urging Solomon in verse 14, "Make haste, my beloved. Be thou like to a roe, that is a gazelle, or a young hart, a deer, upon the mountains of spices." Well, closing thoughts and observations. There is a phrase, a cliche, an adage that states love is blind. Now, it's often credited to the English playwright William Shakespeare, who used it several times in his plays. However, the phrase first appeared in Geoffrey Chaucer's Merchant Tale, which was written in 1405, where he wrote, "Love is blind all day and may not see." Now, author Pauline Thomason offers a different humorous take on the same idea, and she wrote, "Love is blind, marriage is the eye-opener." Well, Hollywood has certainly painted a tragic picture of love and marriage driven by lust and far from what the Creator intended for man and woman. Our society has sacrificed innocence and purity in pursuit of instant gratification and pleasure. And sadly, it seems even the membership of the church is no better. Well, the scriptures encourage believers to reflect self-sacrificing, enduring, and honorable love in their marriages, an earthly picture of Christ's love. In his epistle to believers in Ephesus, Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 5 these words, "Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it." In verse 33 of Ephesians 5, "Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife, even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband." Well, what a wonderful love story we've seen throughout our study of the Song of Solomon, and I hope it inspires you regarding the pure nature of sincere love. We've also seen the emphasis upon purity, and not only the purity of the bride, but the fact that even her brothers have protected her purity. And all that we would have today, parents and brothers who would protect their innocence and the innocence of their sisters. Well, God bless you. Thank you for being a part of our study. And we will begin tomorrow a study in the book of Proverbs. Of course, the author, Solomon, the king of Israel. God bless, and bye-bye.